بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين. This is the first video in a series which we're going to be launching. It's going to be called Office Hours with Dr. Ahmad. So it's like you come and you visit your professor on campus and you have some questions and he answers them. So it's going to just deal with Q&A. I get a lot of questions and answers through my social media accounts. So I'll be selecting various questions, usually just one question per video, maybe more depending on the nature of the inquiry, and I will address those questions. So I am now in the process of reviving my YouTube channel. I've been away for a while. Excuse me. I'd had a series of lectures which I had to give, and one of those is actually up on my channel. It's called Karbala Event and Meaning, 6 lectures that took a lot of research. So if you haven't had a chance yet, please do check that out. I will also be very soon, probably around next week, inshallah, launching my Patreon account. So stay tuned for details. And if you have any questions, you can send them to me through my social media account on my Facebook. If you go on Facebook and search for Dr. Sayyad Ahmad, that's Dr. D-R-S-A-I-Y-A-D, Sayyad Ahmad, A-H-M-A-D. And so I'm even going to give you an email where you can send your questions. It is provided in the video description, so look below, and I look forward to getting your questions. Let's move to the question for this video. So this question comes from Imdad Hussain, who's from South Asia, and he contacted me via Facebook a long time back, and I promised him I'd make a video, and I just wasn't able to do it with so many other things going on. So what he's asking about is an issue relating to Ibn Sina, famous philosopher in the history of Islam and physician as well. And for some reason, and this is what he wants to know what the reason is, different scholars and authorities throughout the history of Islam have accused Ibn Sina of being a non-Muslim, or in other words, upholding doctrines which cause a person to leave Islam and therefore become a kafir or an unbeliever. So he wants to know my view on this and the background. Well, all of this goes back to a person named Al-Ghazali, and that's Abu Hamid Al-Ghazali, who wrote this famous book called Tahafut al-Falasifa, The Incoherence of the Philosophers. This is the most widely available edition of this book. It's published in Cairo. This happens to be the 7th printing, At-Tab'at al-Sabi'ah, by Dar al-Ma'arif Press. And this is edited by Dr. Suleiman Dunya. And there is an English translation of this book by Michael Marmura, published in the Brigham Young University series on Islamic philosophy. It came out years ago. I don't know if it's still in print. You can check Amazon. I actually do not happen to have that English translation. I have a much older one. So it was translated before, and it was published in Pakistan in 1963 by something called the Pakistan Philosophical Congress. Imagine that. A Congress of Philosophers. Golly. And it's called Al-Ghazali's Tahafut al-Falasifa, The Incoherence of the Philosophers. And you can see it here. It's translated by Sabih Ahmed Kamali. So the way that this book is structured is it's structured in the form of problems. There are 20 problems or issues dealt with, and then there's a conclusion. And at the end of the book, so in the conclusion, Al-Ghazali passes a kind of verdict on philosophers. And when he talks about philosophers, he means Ibn Sina and al-Arabi. So this was a book which Al-Ghazali wrote in refutation of philosophy, and the title Tahafut al-Falasifa indicates that philosophy itself is self-contradictory by the form of the verb from which the word tahafut is derived. And so some people have translated the meaning of the title as the auto-destruction of the philosophers. In other words, Al-Ghazali was of the view that philosophy, and again by philosophy he means the philosophy of Ibn Sina al-Farabi, collapses on its own contradictions. So at the end, we'll read from the conclusion. It's pretty short, and it will show you what exactly is going on. So this is on page 249 of the 1963 Sabih Ahmad Kamali translation published by the Pakistan Philosophical Congress. If someone says, now that you have analyzed the theories of the philosophers, will you conclude by saying that one who believes in them ought to be branded with infidelity, kufr, and punished with death? All right, so let's see what that is in the original Arabic of the Suleiman Dunya translation. So in Suleiman Dunya's translation on page 307, it's khatima, not which he has, which is the Arabic there, which is translated as conclusion. It says, فَإِنْ قَالَ قَائِلٌ قد فصلتم مذاهب هؤلاء أفتقطعون القول. Then in Arabic it says here بتفكيرهم, which is a misprint. It has to be بتكفيرهم. ووجوب القتل لمن يعتقد اعتقادهم, question mark, exclamation point. The punctuation in Arabic works is always very weird. This punctuation is really not something necessary in classical Arabic, but people throw it in. So then it says, we shall answer, قُلْنَا, to brand the philosophers with infidelity is inevitable, so far as three problems are concerned. And then he says what they are. I'm saying, namely, قُلْنَا تكفيرهم لابد منه في ثلاث مسائل. So there are three issues that Al-Ghazali says result in kufr. Wow. On the part of the philosophers. What are those three issues? Number one, the problem of the eternity of the world, where they maintain that all the substances are eternal. Okay, so here it says, إحداها مسألة قدم العالم وقولهم إن الجواهر كلها قديمة. The problem is, in the translation, we have the word qidam in Arabic. So does qidam mean eternity or does it mean non-originated? You might say, well, what's the difference? Well, there is one. So when people like Al-Ghazali speak of creation or not, or something being uncreated, that means that, all right, you have something which is the category of the uncreated, which is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who has existed and always will and continues to exist. And then you have that which is created. And for them, creation is creatio ex nihilo, creation out of nothing. And so they held that the world was uncreated in that sense. Theologians like Al-Ghazali. And so he's saying that the philosophers upheld the view that the universe, and that's what al-alam really means in Arabic, the universe, the cosmos, everything other than Allah, kullu ma siwa Allah, saying that, that the alam, the world, the cosmos, the universe is qadim. So that's the first issue, and I'll speak briefly about each of these. I'm not going to give a whole lecture. The second one is their assertion that divine knowledge does not encompass individual objects. That's وَالثَّانِيَةُ قَوْلُهُمْ إِنَّ اللَّهَ تَعَالَى لَا يُحِيطُ عِلْمًا بِالْجُزْئِيَّاتِ الْحَادِثَةِ مِنَ الْأَشْخَاصِ. And number three, their denial of the resurrection of bodies. So this is all on the same page 249 of the English translation. But in the Arabic original, it goes to the next page, which is page 308. And the third is وَالثَّالِثَةُ إِنْكَارُهُمْ بَعْثَ الْأَجْسَادِ بَعْثَ الْأَجْسَادِ وَحَشْرِهَا. Their denial of the resurrection of the bodies is how Sabih Ahmad Kamali translated. I'm not going to get into the translation issues now. So there's these three issues. So one has to do with the notion of the eternity of the world. The second has to do with God's knowledge of the particulars. And the third has to do with bodily resurrection. And it is held by Al-Ghazali that philosophers like Ibn Sina, and that's really who we're talking about, that's what the question was about, because of the doctrines that they upheld on these 3 points, were guilty of kufr. And the conclusion goes on and says, look, there are other smaller issues which aren't so bad and which you could discuss and debate, but I don't really have time to go into them, is what Al-Ghazali says, and he sort of concludes the book there. So the first issue on the eternity of the world, the philosophers were of the view that the universe is non-originated, that it's not, in other words, that it's not originated in time. They did not deny that God is the creator of the world and is the, in fact, that God is both efficient cause and final cause of the universe, that he is al-illatul fa'ila, the efficient cause, as well as the teleological end of the universe. So, because they adopted the Aristotelian notion of the four causes. So, four causes or four sort of modes of explanation in physics and then also in metaphysics. So, namely, the formal cause, material cause. Let's go in order: material cause, formal cause, efficient cause, and final cause. So, for philosophers like Ibn Sina, Allah Subhanahu wa Taala is both the efficient cause and ultimate teleological end or final cause of the universe. And so for them, there can be no imperfection in divine action, meaning that God as efficient cause, he simply wills the universe and it comes into being, and there is no time lag. If you or I want to make something, let's say you want to build a shed in your backyard, you have to get the materials together, the material cause, put it into the form of a shed, that's the formal cause, and you are the efficient cause of that. And then the shed is for storing tools, for example. That's its final cause, its purpose. Now it takes you whatever amount of time it takes you to build the shed or to make a cup of tea, for example. There's a certain amount of deliberation and so forth, but that process, that time lag, does not apply to God. And so the whole notion of the category of time is really what is at issue here. What is really at issue in this problem is the nature of creation. How is it that Allah makes something, and therefore what is the nature of the God-world relationship? That is what the philosophers were investigating. They were not rejecting, as Al-Ghazali seems to think in this text, the idea that God is the creator. So Allah is prior to the universe, but for the philosophers, he is logically prior, not temporally prior. And because there can be no temporal lag between God and his acts, there is no temporal lag. There's no time in particular where the universe is created. And indeed, the notion of time is meaningless for God. So that's the first issue. The second issue is on the nature of divine knowledge. For the philosophers, they understood divine knowledge to be a knowledge of universals, and through that Allah knows the particulars. It's not that God doesn't know or have knowledge or perceive, if these are even the right terms, a black ant walking on a black rock in the gloom of night in some remote desert somewhere. He does. But the question is, so they don't deny that God knows these things. The question is, what is, again, the nature of divine knowledge? And they held that God knew all things, but he knew them through universals. Finally, there's the question of the bodily resurrection. They are not denying that there is a resurrection. What they're denying is that when a human being is resurrected, is it exactly this very same physical body? So the philosophers had this notion of the impossibility of the recurrence of the non-existent. Istihalat or imtina, i'adat al-ma'dum. The return, so to speak, of the non-existent, that once something ceases to exist, it does not exist again in the same way. What they meant is that if you cause something to completely go out of existence, so if I take, let's say, some random physical object like this pen, and I absolutely smash it all up and grind it all up and then burn it. So this pen ceases to exist. This pen will not come back. You can't make it come back. Now, the thing is, this is a mass-produced pen. I have a box full of them, but they're not exactly the same. And so when they say that something doesn't come back, they mean that it does not come back with its accidents. And among the accidents is the maqula, or the category of time. And so that's what they said, that whatever is resurrected, you are resurrected, but it's not your exact same physical body. And that raises the question, when you're resurrected after you die, will you be resurrected as a baby? Will you be resurrected at the age how you were when you were 25 years old? Let's say you die at the age of 89. Or will you be resurrected in the form that you are at the age of 89? So the question again has to do with the nature of resurrection. In other words, there is some sort of a resurrection body according to these people, but it's not the same physical body. And so what passes on is the soul. So the soul doesn't actually, your body decays, you die, your soul departs. Anyhow, so these are the three issues. So once again, to recapitulate, the question of the eternity of the world, or the eternity of the cosmos, that is to say, the origination or non-origination in a more precise philosophical sense, the nature of divine creation, what is the nature of the God-world relationship? That's the first one. The second one is the nature of divine knowledge, and the third is the nature of the resurrection of human beings. So this is where the difference came up, and Al-Ghazali didn't like the views that people like Ibn Sina had on this, and so he rejected them because he thought that they were in conflict with Islamic belief. And Al-Ghazali was an adherent of the Shāfi'ī school of law and the Ash'ari school of theology. So when we say that Al-Ghazali, he rejected Ibn Sina and branded him an infidel, we have to keep something in mind, which people often don't. You have to have a historical sense. Al-Ghazali, he had different views throughout his life, and the Al-Ghazali of the book, the Tahafut al-Falasifa, is not the same person as the Al-Ghazali of the revival of the religious sciences, or the Kitab al-Ahya. So I'm just going to run through quickly the curve, if we can call it that, or the trajectory of Al-Ghazali's life, and I want to plot the key points here. And I have saved myself some trouble and conveniently taken them from this timeline, which is published in Al-Ghazali and the Ismailis by Farooq Mitha. And he gives a nice timeline of Al-Ghazali's life on Roman numeral pages 20 to 21. So that's XX to XXI. You can see it here. But anyhow, we'll just run through these dates very quickly. So Al-Ghazali is born in the year 450 or 1058 at a place called Tus in northern Iran, and Tus as a city does not exist anymore. Then from about the year 470 to 478, which would correspond to 1077 to 1085, he studied with Imam al-Haramain Abu al-Ma'ali al-Juwayni, who died in 478 or 1085. Very important master for Al-Ghazali, who educated him in theology. Between the years 478 and 484, which correspond to 1085 to 1091, he becomes affiliated with the Seljuk vizier Nizam al-Mulk. And so Nizam al-Mulk, under the Seljuk sort of military de facto dynasty under the umbrella of the Abbasids, is really running political and day-to-day life. And they embark upon a plan of education, of a kind of educational policy of spreading the Sunni madhab in the form of Ash'arism and Maturidism. And this was very much in reaction to goings-on in Egypt, which was under the Shi'i Fatimid dynasty. And so Shi'ism, especially in the Fatimid version or variety, represented a kind of existential threat, if you like, ideologically speaking. And so they established this. And so Nizam al-Mulk established this chain of colleges, this kind of college campuses, so to speak, is maybe how we would say it now, but a large number of educational institutions, which were known as the Nizamiya madrasas, and Al-Ghazali is recruited into this project and teaches at the one in Baghdad. And it's in this period from, in other words, 484 to 488 or 1091 to 1095 that Al-Ghazali writes the Tahafut al-Falasifa, as well as the Maqasid al-Falasifa, as well as the al-Mustadhiri, as well as his book Al-Iqtisad fil-I'tiqad and other works. But definitely these 1, 2, 3, 4, which I mentioned. So Al-Ghazali is a kind of public intellectual. You know, he's a kind of, sorry, not a public intellectual, he's a kind of establishment intellectual working for these guys, and he's upholding a particular interpretation and of Islam. And philosophy was considered dangerous as well, because especially at that time it was associated with certain currents in Ismaili Shi'ism as well. Now, Ibn Sina was not an Ismaili, but that's a whole other discussion. He's his own person. We'll just say he's a philosopher. And so philosophy, again, posed a kind of a threat to the theological school of the Ash'aris. And so this is what he was in the service of. But then around 488, and that's a period of about 11 years, from 488 to 499 or 1095 to 1106, Al-Ghazali undergoes a huge crisis. He decides to flee, quietly, leave Baghdad. You don't really leave a job like that. So he makes it known that he's going off on the pilgrimage, and he disappears, spends time in Damascus and Al-Quds, and he gets involved in Tasawwuf, in Sufism. And during this period, and as he comes out of it, he authors his very famous book, Al-Ihya, or Ihya Ulum ad-Din, the revival of the religious sciences, in which he presents a kind of synthesis of Sufism and Shafi'i law and Ash'ari theology. And then he returns around 499 to Toulouse, to Nishapur, and he teaches from then until about 503 of the Hijrah. So that's 1106 to 1109. And it's there that he authors his autobiography, Al-Munqidh min al-Dalal, Deliverance from Error, and then he dies in 505 or 1111. So Al-Ghazali goes through these different periods in his life. And I wonder if he would really have upheld that same view near the end of his life, because another book which he wrote, and I'm not exactly sure what the timeline is on all of the writings, but people have looked into this. There are works that try and give a chronology of when he wrote what. But the book in question is definitely a product of his later years. It's called Faisal al-Tafriqa Bayn al-Islam wa Zandaqa. In fact, there's an English translation by Sherman Jackson that was published by Oxford, Pakistan. I don't know if it was published in the U.S., but Faisal al-Tafriqa Bayn al-Islam wa Zandaqa means, the decisive statement between, orthodox, correct Islamic belief and incorrect or even, criminally dissident belief in Islam. And in that, he has this very expansive view that says that, anyone who upholds the shahada, ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, and upholds the prayer, basically says, the Ahlul Qibla, the people who face the Kaaba, who face Mecca when they pray, they are Muslim, and you have to leave them alone. So I don't know that Al-Ghazali would necessarily have upheld the same view towards the end of his life. So this is the background. So people today generally who uphold this idea that Ibn Sina was a non-Muslim, or he had left Islam by virtue of upholding such beliefs, that I think is where the origin of that comes from. We know for a fact, however, that Ibn Sina, never came out and said he was repudiating Islam. We have an autobiographical statement from Ibn Sina. We know that he used to pray. He would go to the masjid. And we have his writings, and I don't think his writings are a joke. Ibn Sina authored a book called Al-Qanun fi al-Tibb, the Canon of Medicine, which was a fundamental, it's a large work, but a fundamental encyclopedic medical textbook, which was the book which people studied even in Europe. There were many translations into Latin and other languages for some 6 or 7 centuries. And I think that, so we can say that over a course of 6 or 7 centuries, untold myriads and millions of people, their lives were made better through the medical knowledge collected by Ibn Sina in such a book. I think that such a contribution is no less than that of any great wali or any great saint. And, Ibn Sina had some very profound dimensions. I really think that he had a very profound spiritual aspect to his life as well. If you read his work, Al-Isharat wa Tanbihat, especially the later part of it, which deals with, what we may call, for want of a better term, Sufism or Irfan. And he authored a number of visionary recitals. In fact, there's a very important book called Avicenna and the Visionary Recital by Henry Corbin. I think this is a very beautiful book, and if you're interested in the deeper dimensions to Ibn Sina, you should get this book. There is a kind of Western establishment, Orientalist establishment view of Ibn Sina as well, upheld by people like Dimitri Gutas and the people who gravitated around him, who would reduce Ibn Sina to simply some sort of a rationalist philosopher. But I don't think that view is tenable. But I'm not going to dwell on that point here. So that's where I would conclude. I would say that if you're interested in Ibn Sina's other dimensions, this is definitely worth looking at. So Imdad Hussein also wanted to know my view, if it's not clear to you up to now. No, I do not consider Ibn Sina to have been a kafir. And I think that Al-Ghazali really misunderstood him in the Tahafut al-Falasifa. And I think that the Tahafut al-Falasifa is a very problematic book as well. And Ibn Rushd dealt with that very well in his Tahafut al-Tahafut. So Ibn Rushd wrote a refutation of Al-Ghazali. And there was a modern Iranian scholar, Sayyid Jalaluddin Ashtiani, who also wrote a response, if you like, or refutation of what Al-Ghazali wrote in Tahafut, but that's in Persian. And in fact, I don't actually have that book, but it is available. So I will conclude here. So no, Ibn Sina was not a kafir, and that's that.